We do have one more inductee today, and this is going to be Aroline Schmitt, and she was nominated by Bill Berry. Aroline, the Christian Science Monitor back in 1947 said this of Aroline. They said, "Every day is Arbor Day for Mrs. Max J. Schmitt." And Gordon McClory said of her, "Mrs. Schmitt has called up senators and representatives and governors and alternately pleaded, threatened, and heckled. They all respect her. They know she is a citizen who just asks for the opportunity to give more to her community than she takes from it. That's why they listen to her." Now today we're going to have Bill Berry and Ruth Schmitt, who is a daughter-in-law, and Stacy Bramwell, who is a granddaughter, give some presentations. And I guess I'll turn it over at this point to Bill Berry.
Thanks, Michael. John, honestly, we're getting close to the end here, folks. Move along. And if you'd like to stand up, that's fine. I'm happy to be here, and I'm old enough to say I knew Don Johnson not well, but I knew him enough to be encouraged by him and talk to him several times. Doug, I remember talking to you on the phone a few years ago. These things take time. Obviously, everybody knows Scott, right? And most of the people you mentioned along the way here, I've had some familiarity with. I must tell you, I did not nominate Aroline Schmitt. I don't really know what did. All I know is about the year 2000, I was asked to prepare a biography, and we didn't have an awful lot of source material, except 6 large archival boxes that are stored with the Wisconsin Historical Society. The story of a citizen activist who was tireless in her work over a period of about 40 years or more, who actually, do I have to stay in field behind this podium? No, right? Okay, I'll hold this a little closer. So it was a story of a citizen activist who was tireless in her activities, and we'll look at some of that today. I'm looking forward to seeing the family members. I must also say that I never really knew how to pronounce her first name. I was giving a presentation about the DDT book in Milwaukee, and who was sitting in the audience with my friend Bill Schulteis, who I served on the River Alliance board with, and I pronounced her name as Aroline throughout the presentation. He came up to me afterwards, Bill did, and said, "I think it's Arlene." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Well, I'm related to her." So you learn a new lesson every day, so we're going to go with that. So, you know, what a story. Believe me, every one of those archival boxes is packed with letters that she wrote to governors, presidents, U.S. senators, people way up on the ladder and way down on the ladder, supporting her environmental causes. She was truly a citizen activist. And I must say, referencing Don Johnson, you know, that his famous stories on DDT concentrations in all of Wisconsin water bodies really did make a huge difference with the DDT story. But he might not have written it or gotten to it as fast as he did it if it wasn't for a citizen activist in Milwaukee by the name of Lori Hodder, who badgered and hectored him for days to try to get that story out. I think he took that information and gave it to Walter Scott, and we got it a little quicker than we might have otherwise. So it starts off in folks with citizen activists like yourselves. This is a brief snapshot of Arlene's life. New York, born and raised. Her mother was a botanist, and she spent a lot of time in the Maine forest, as you can see. Her grandfather was a Wisconsin lumberman, which is sort of interesting because she spent much of her life in Wisconsin fighting lumbermen. Family was very likely connected to Gifford Pinchot, who, as you can see, right around 1941, during the start of the war, asked her on behalf of the Forest Service to be a timber cruiser. So when you're a timber cruiser, you go to someone's private lands and say the government's looking at this land, we may need it for the war, and oftentimes the person you were talking to was holding a shotgun. And other times, she traveled on troop trains across the country. The thing was, in those days, the troops got to sit down, and little Aroline Schmitt stood on many of those troop trains. She continued throughout a number of years with the Forest Service, also in Michigan Extension. A little known fact about her is that one of her major causes was sustainable forestry, which she managed to end up teaching some Korean and Chinese children over the years. So interesting life, totally engaged on her causes. Those are some of the organizations to which she belonged, and to which she often signed her letters as the chair of the Junior Gardens Club of Milwaukee one day, and when the cause was forest, the next day she would be the founder of Forest Magazine, or the Committee of 1000, or the Citizen Committee for the Menominee Reservation, or you name it, a whole host of them. All of them were vehicles for her to pursue her citizen activism. And what a story it was. Those files, which I revisited recently on the 5th floor of the library building here in Stevens Point, where we have one of these wonderful jewels of our state that is the archival, the regional archives, that you or anyone else can go to these archives, and if some famous citizen from history has archived their materials, they'll deliver it to your closest regional archive, and you too can become an expert on little known facts. She was absolutely amazing in that she wrote letters herself, used the telephone extensively, and was constantly in contact with people from all walks of life about one conservation cause or another. And you know, I must say that much of the time she did her work in the 40s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, she was ill. She was not well. She had a chronic illness which limited her to her bedroom often. She may have been the first person to perfect the home office, well before any of the rest of us. You know, I wonder when we have archives like this and wonderful material there that she saved for all of us, outlining all the paths that she took in her work. You know, I wonder what it'll be like 40 years from now when someone's standing here. We send electronic smoke signals to one another and they disappear. We don't write as people from other generations did. The letters that she wrote were fluent and long, and the responses she got from governors and U.S. senators were equally fluent and long. It was a different time, and we wonder where our history will go in the future. Thanks to, as she signed her name frequently on her letters, Mrs. Max J. Schmitt, 1912 North 84th Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That's how she signed it very frequently. Thanks to her, she saved this all for us. She was a part of the conservation movement in Wisconsin at a critical time. You know, she fits that profile of citizen activist. Persistent, not going to take no for an answer, no fear, or if there is fear, it's hidden. And over time, obviously respected, because when she wrote to governors, they replied. Some of her causes, sustainable forestry was right at the top, and so here she was cruising timber for the U.S. government, and at the same time telling lumbermen to practice sustainable forestry. Indeed, telling the Forest Service we need to do that as we harvest this wood that's necessary for the war. She was tireless in her efforts to preserve what remnants there were of the virgin forests, and often put herself against lumbermen in this cause. Of course, much of her work was being done at the time when the forest pretty much had been leveled in northern Wisconsin, but she knew of a single stand of virgin hemlock she was going to try to protect. She had her early interest in running on the research station, which ended up being the U.S. Forest Research Station. She had some of the earliest interest in a conservation camp in Niga River, which became, as we know, Trees for Tomorrow. She was a tireless advocate for the Flambeau Wilderness, and indeed, many of her letters and articles are written about that particular resource. Big advocate of preserving what was left of the wilderness in the Porcupine Mountains, and a big advocate of setting aside more land for Terrionnery State Park. You'll notice one thing about all these is that the causes she advocated for, they ended up being successful. Not the only one who did it, but she had a strong voice in this area. Guess what? When Alma Leopold died in 1948, Governor Redenbaum proposed in his next budget to cut the staffing funding for wildlife management position at the University of Wisconsin. Guess who got on Governor Redenbaum about that? Aroline Schmitt. Shortly later, the money was restored to the budget. So that's a little example of citizen activism. It's also reminded that politicians at that time were capable of doing knuckleheaded things also. She was also, she came from an era of people, we'll look at some of the names of those who were in the Conservation Hall of Fame in another slide here. They had seen civilization trample what was left of the wilderness, much of what was left of the wilderness. They had seen the great northern forest level and the great grasslands of southern Wisconsin mowed over. They watched trees fall on behalf of highway projects. They simply came from a time when they looked around them and said, we have to do something if we're going to have anything left of our natural world. And so she was from that generation, and many of them became enshrined in the Conservation Hall of Fame later, people who said, wait, stop, let's step back and take a look at what we're doing. So obviously we heard about her being the DDT ban previously. The first organizational meeting of the Citizens Natural Resource Association, which pursued the ban on DDT, was held at the home of Mrs. Max J. Schmitt. It was the organizational meeting of CNRA later would become a major force in that particular battle. One day she was advocating to save the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, and literally the next day, she would be telling state officials that there is one chestnut tree left in Whitewater, Wisconsin, and we need to save it. This is the breadth and depth of her activities. She was tireless, and there was not a conservation issue that didn't interest her. In her own words, kind of what captures what many of the conservation figures at the time talked about, loss of our natural assets, and the causes included DDT, obviously. She also could be very pointed in her letters. Look at the one she wrote to Lester Blake, who was the director of the Conservation Department in 1950. I have been shocked with the proposal to place mourning dove on the game bird list. Has the Wisconsin Conservation Program been such a failure that you must now stoop to this level? Well, he replied to it. D.C. Evers, the great lumberman of northern Wisconsin and a member of the Conservation Hall of Fame, here's what she wrote to him. She was very upset that those people were cutting some hemlock near Moose Lake in 1942. Things just went on and on. Her contacts were up and across, and all over. These are just a few of the people she wrote to. Yes, she had correspondence with Joseph McCarthy. She invited him to the conservation camp in Eagle River, to which he replied, thank you, but I'm busy. All of these people had correspondence with her and replied to her. And certainly she wasn't alone in this era. Basically, in the time she lived and did her work, these were the people who were working on conservation in Wisconsin at the same time. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention these three Haskell Noyes, William J.P. Haber, and Dahlberg. Is Chris Thomas back there yet? Chris knows a lot about this story, the creation of the Wisconsin Conservation Commission, an actual citizens commission to oversee the activities of the Wisconsin Conservation Department. It was first proposed in 1927 and ended up being created years later, and those three men who she worked very closely with were also some of the key figures in that early Conservation Commission. Often corresponded with Aldo Leopold, one of her best friends and traveling companions, Romine Woody, and this is just a who's who of Wisconsin conservation history at that time. Every one of the people I mentioned here, her files includes correspondence with them. So she was talking with the people who were making things happening, and she was definitely doing it herself. This is an idea of the kinds of people we inducted in this Conservation Hall of Fame. I just took a look at the names of these people, and some of them had jobs in the conservation world, but most of them would tell you probably that they were conservation activists and citizen activists first. And this is where the action takes place, folks. And so these are just a few of the people who who did the same kind of work that Arlene Schmitt did. So, just a brief snapshot of a life totally well lived, totally dedicated to the conservation cause, and someone who, after going through 6 boxes of archival material I never met, I feel like I know. So thanks for being here. Thanks for honoring these great people, and I'm so happy that someone like Arlene Schmitt, after all these years, is going to be inducted into the Conservation Hall of Fame. So the family members will be joining us, and I can't wait to hear from you.
Ruth, you want to give a few words?
Well, I think Stacy was going to start.
We'll do with Stacy. Okay, Stacy, you want to come up and join us?
Sorry, I was expecting to go out of order. I would very much like to thank the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame and specifically Bill Berry for speaking so well of her. As her family, we always knew my grandmother was pretty remarkable. In fact, some of the stories my dad told about her almost seemed implausible. How was it that a woman who suffered so many physical limitations was able to achieve so much from the confines of a sickbed, or the woman of her era could become such a trusted advisor to so many powerful men without herself holding any special titles or status? One of my favorite stories that Dad used to tell about her was about how she struggled to find time in her busy schedule to accept an invitation from President Roosevelt to the White House to acknowledge her service, because she didn't think an honorary meeting would be as productive of a use of her time as her other commitments. For me, that story gave me some possible insight into how Grandma could be so impervious to obstacles. Ordinary conventions can't get in the way of a woman whose sole focus is her mission. As you already know, my grandmother was often unable to travel to meet with people in person because of her health, so she had to rely on other ways to connect with them. I know a little bit about what it was like to be on the receiving end of those efforts. When Grandma moved to Idaho due to her health, it was too difficult for her to have visitors or to return to Wisconsin. Because she was unable to see us in person, she came up with some very creative ways to bridge the gap. For example, when I was too young for ordinary letters, she wrote me illustrated stories about the adventures of Bush Bear and Whompy. They were cloud animals we could both find in the sky if we looked for them. When she worried she might be just a disembodied voice on the phone to me, she made me life-size ragdolls of both her and my grandfather, complete with pipe cleaner glasses, so I could feel their presence. It worked. I enjoyed many tea parties with them. She encouraged curiosity in all us kids by sending us boxes and boxes of educational books, magazines, and enrolling us in memberships to conservation organizations. My sister credits a set of books about animals she sent for sparking a lifelong interest, culminating in a degree in biology. But nothing she gave us could have given us a greater appreciation for nature and its conservation than the land we grew up on. She bought 100 acres of land in the Kettle Moraine, at first just to conserve it, but later let us build our house on it. Thanks to Grandma, our childhoods were spent exploring the woods, hills, swamps, and river that surrounded it. Wildlife wasn't just contained on the pages of the book she sent, it was in our backyard. I finally got to spend time with Grandma in person in high school when I visited her in Idaho. Even in poor health and in old age, she was sharp and engaging. She and my aunt told me so many interesting stories. I later wrote to ask my aunt for more. Here are some of the stories Maggie sent to me in her own words. Aroline's family, especially her mother Wendy Jean, worked with Mr. and Mrs. Pinchot, their good friends, to create the Allegheny State Park. Through that association, Aroline was appointed at the beginning of the war to work for the Forest Service, headed for Pinchot. Her job was to find and cruise the amount of board feet in all the forests in the U.S. and Alaska that contained the specific kinds of wood needed for the war effort. She reported to the Forest Service and the governors of the states that contained the wood. She traveled by car, train, or airplane. The trains were usually troop trains, and only the troops were allowed seats, so she had to travel long hours standing up. She used to return home exhausted, with terrible headaches after being gone for days. In the morning, she would get a call telling her where she was going and how long she'd be gone. She'd go to the Forest Service office, hand a report from her last trip to her secretary, pick up the necessary papers, and take off again. Toward the end of the war, she worked with governors, writing legislation necessary to keep the forest protected. As a result, she had many threats on her life from jibbo loggers, and companies hired thugs when they didn't want to comply with the laws. Dad worried about her when he didn't hear from her, and often called her boss. She was the only woman doing this kind of work that we knew of, at least in the eastern region, which is still based in Milwaukee. After the war, she continued working for the Forest Service. During that time, she and others created conservation organizations which specialized in different areas. Often she wrote legislation for the federal government, state and local too. When she went to Washington, D.C. for a hearing before a congressional committee, she only had enough money for her transportation and her room, but not enough to buy dinners, so she made excuses and ate in her room. When she got home, she was sick from exhaustion and lack of food. Sometimes I would drive up to Madison with her to hearings on state bills. She was a small person, so she'd be lost in a crowd of big lumbermen trying to browbeat her. She never backed down, and they admired her for that, even though they didn't like her personally. I remember the first time I went with her, she said, "Watch, they will all show up wearing wool pants, boots, and plaid shirts. Don't let that intimidate you. They really wear suits to work." Mom always wore a business suit. Her accomplishments in service extended into other areas of the community as well. Maggie told me stories about how Grandma volunteered to teach nature classes at her school, including astronomy lessons about the stars and planets. She worked with juvenile Judge Breitenbach to champion children's causes. Maggie remembered going with her to pick up kids in trouble to take them to their parents. Sometimes the kids themselves would call for her help. She and my dad would also ride along when Grandma took buckets of flowers to shut-ins and sick people. Many she didn't even know. She worked on special projects for the city of Wauwatosa, later for the League of Women Voters, including addressing the world's water problems. She built a medical arts building in West Bend and ran it until she sold it to the doctors in it. All through the years, including the war, she was active in the Garden Club Federation. They gave a scholarship in name at the University of Wisconsin for a woman student in the field of conservation. As you can tell from all the stories you've heard today, she was pretty much unstoppable when she set out to do something. One of the greatest legacies my grandmother left behind was the example that there are very few obstacles that are truly insurmountable as long as you don't allow them to be. I hope her story inspires anybody who doubts her ability to make an impact to start by just picking up a pen or a phone. The progress that she and the others who have been honored here before her are depending on it. Thank you again for this honor and for also recognizing what an extraordinary woman my grandmother was.
I'm a little short, so I have to look over the top here. But I'm going to just tell you a few things about her and her children's memories. Aroline had 2 children. One was Maxine, who lived in Idaho, and the other was John, who was my husband. So Aroline was my mother-in-law. And she certainly was not short of giving me advice as to, what a woman should do. I did go onto a school board for 9 years, and my husband said, "Oh my God, I just married my mother." So I kind of thought about it, and I thought, I don't think I could come close to what she has accomplished. But as a child, my husband John remembers being in the back seat of her car for trips all over Wisconsin. He, from early on, would come into their kitchen, and there would be sitting Governor Nelson, Senator Proxmire, other important officials. And so he would try to get a cup of coffee and exit as much as he could. She had Aroline had straight, what do you call it, direct line into the governor's mansion. So she could pick up the phone and call the governor, and I believe it was Nelson at the time, and like, you know, if the boys, if my husband John and his friend were wrestling, she'd say, you know, be quiet and talking to the governor. And so even his friend went home and kind of shaking his head, like, you know, who is this person who's talking to the governor from Little Wauwatosa? Well then, the other thing that he told me that at Christmas time, Walter Scott was a very good friend of hers, and it was Christmas, so Arlene went shopping, and she told my husband and her son-in-law, you two get the tree up. As soon as Walter delivers that tree, I want it up when I get home. Well, here came Walter with a tree about 14 feet tall, and they just had a branched out. So what they did was they cut the tree off so it looked like it came to the ceiling, and then they climbed up on the roof and put the rest of the tree on top, all decorated. So it was one of the few times that Aroline was speechless. And my husband said that there were cars passing by their house on a regular basis. One of the things he told me was that my mother is a good cook, but she always burns the vegetables, so I was prepared before my first visit to meet them. My husband also liked the perks of being her son because she did spend a lot of time at the state fair. She was a president of the garden club, and I believe she did some judging and often was very involved in the flower show at the state fair. So she turned my husband loose. He would still have been pretty young, but he had money and he could go all over the state fair and he didn't have to tell her, you know, what he was doing. He thought it was wonderful to be the son of Aroline. The other thing is that the family, when they had a vacation, enjoyed some fabulous campsites. My husband said, you know, that the Rangers made sure that their family had a wonderful spot to spend their vacation. I'll tell you a little bit about my first meeting with Aroline as a future daughter-in-law. We drove up to the house, and I really couldn't see the front door. I was just trying to guess, how am I going to get in this house? Well, she had planted blue spruce very close to the front door, and it was huge, it was gorgeous, and she wouldn't let anyone touch it because it was a tree and we take care of the tree. So we kind of sidled into the house to get in the front door, but she made no apologies about that. I found out a family of raccoons had taken permanent residence of their chimney to their fireplace. And sometimes a baby raccoon would fall down into the fireplace, but she'd make sure it got back to the mama and the papa. And she just told me every spring, she just loved seeing the babies, and it didn't bother her a bit. I don't know that they put more than 4 or 5 fires before the raccoons took their habitat at their chimney. The other thing is there were many things they had. They had an unusual array of pets. They had a dog which was part Spitz, and John's friends would come in the house. The Spitz guarded that house in a very serious manner. But they got a rabbit for Easter, and that rabbit was allowed to run free in the house, no cages, and it got to be so big that it would thump its foot, and it scared all the dogs out of their front yard. I just couldn't believe it. And then one day, Max Schmitt opened the front door on a day like this, and a yellow canary flew in. So the canary joined the other two and had the free rein to fly all over the house. She certainly was respectful of all living animals. I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about Aroline's health. When she was young, her father knew, her adopted father knew that she had an aneurysm in the brain, and she was always kept from any activities that were too taxing for her. So she had her own private library, and I think that's where she began to learn some pretty serious, just basic knowledge about conservation and biology and whatnot. But there came a time where she was either going to die or they had to do surgery in the brain. She, we believe, is the first surviving patient surviving from brain surgery. And she spent an entire year in bed. She had a typewriter, she had a TV, she had a telephone, so that even though she had a long period of recovery, she still was keeping up her correspondence, her phone calls, and doing whatever she could for a good cause. When she was up and around again, she had severe pain, and she had, her left side had no feeling, but she would never tell anybody about it, nor would she slow down. I don't think she missed a step during most of that year. And the doctor would be just amazed to know that she lived to be 90 years old and really did stay active with her loves. So this gives me an opportunity to thank Mr. Michael John and Mr. Barry. Our family is extremely honored that you are recognizing our grandmother and mother-in-law. And there are 2 great-grandchildren here today, and there are cousins, the Schulteisens, and we have a relative that saw an article in Green Bay paper, and she showed up today, so we are just thrilled. We're quite a small family, but this obviously is a group that was her family as well. We also have Mr. Bill Schulteis's children, grandchildren here. And so my two grandchildren are here. And I know that we all are joined together and tell you how pleased and honored we are for this wonderful recognition. We're just hoping that many more will follow in Aroline's footsteps and keep the forest as a precious resource for all future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was wonderful. Representative Schenkel, let's do one more here, and then we'll move on. Let you go to your next time you have a busy life.
It's an honor to present this citation by the state legislature. Know you by his presence. Whereas every year the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame inducts a small group of individuals into the Hall of Fame to recognize the important contributions each has made to natural resource management in the state. And whereas Aroline Schmitt has been chosen as a 2019 Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame inductee for her lifelong environmental activism in Wisconsin and dedication to advancing forest conservation efforts across the country. And whereas Aroline was born in New York in 1904, the granddaughter of a Wisconsin lumberman and daughter of a botanist, and moved to Milwaukee in the 1920s to work as a nurse, while always maintaining a personal passion for the natural world. And whereas she channeled that passion into her work surveying timberlands in the West and helping to facilitate federal resource and land management programs for the United States Forest Service from the Second World War until 1961. And whereas during this period, she consistently advocated for sustainable forestry practices, personally lobbying politicians, conservationists, powerful interest groups, and industrial foresters by attending legislative meetings and maintaining a tremendous output of written correspondence. And whereas she founded, led, and worked for a variety of conservation organizations, including the National Forest Group, the Citizen Natural Resources Association, and the Wisconsin Garden Club Federation. And whereas Aroline fought as both an individual and a representative of the aforementioned organizations to achieve significant conservation milestones in Wisconsin and elsewhere, including the protection of the Flambeau State Forest, the acquisition of forest lands for the Wisconsin Conservation Commission, the protection of the Menominee Tribal Forest, and the establishment of several major conservation facilities that conduct critical work to this day. And whereas, despite the challenging professional culture for women during the years she was most active, and despite chronic health problems, Aroline upheld a lifelong and inspirational dedication to conservation advocacy. Now, therefore, the members of the Wisconsin legislature do hereby commend Aroline Schmitt for her lifelong dedication to conservation in Wisconsin and honor her for her induction into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. Congratulations.